Thanks very much, and welcome to the members of the Society, to the conservation professionals who are joining us, and to the members of the Mulready Group who've been invited. So we're in for an interesting afternoon. Can I reiterate that we need to use chat for questions? If you use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, write your questions there and we'll deal with them towards the end. The idea today is that we get through the main part of the program in about an hour, including the questions, at the end of which there'll be a short break. And if those who remain want to ask further questions, then we'll continue. Can you please mute your mobiles, clocks, and anything else that's going to annoy the speaker? And I now, without any further ado, introduce Victoria Stevens, who's been doing a really super job on conserving our Perkins Bacon archives, or at least a very small part of our Perkins Bacon archive. There's a long way for us still to go yet. So Victoria, welcome. The floor, as they say, is yours.
That's fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Chris. I will just share my screen so you can see, oops, wrong one. How about that? Can everybody see my screen? Yes, Mike's saying yes. So I will presume that you all can, even though you're all now.
Right. And Victoria, we're just going to mute everybody and then unmute you.
Okay.
So just a sec. Okay, you're okay, Victoria. You'll be able to speak to us now.
Good to go. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much to the Royal Philatelic Society for inviting me to speak again about the Perkins Bacon collection, which really has been a superb conservation project and something that I've gained a lot of pleasure from. So I'm hoping that I can pass a little bit of that on to you too. So just a little bit about myself, first of all, just to get that over and done with. I'm a library and archive conservator. I'm a freelance library and archive conservator. I work for myself from my studio in Reading, but I work all over the country, and I'm very, lockdown's been delightful for not having to travel quite so much. So it's really nice to be in one place for once. But I work on the library and archive collections of museums, educational establishments, and also religious collections such as cathedrals and individual churches. But a large part of my work is definitely for museums, which definitely throw up some really interesting projects like the Perkins Bacon. And the purpose of conservation is really very much focused on use, whatever that is. So that can be for display, for people to access the material by seeing it in a display function, or for research on what is a very important part of the philatelic history and story in this country and across the world. But really the prime aim is to connect people to their, whatever institution they belong to their historical collections, and start to form some stories and some background and some structure to the history of those organisations. And that's very much what projects like the Perkins Bacon project are all about. And that brings me round to setting the context for our talk. Now, I know most of you are steeped in philately and are fully aware who Perkins Bacon were, but I will explain for the purposes of those who don't know quite so much about the company. And this is actually slightly terrifying, as there is undoubtedly people out there in online who know a great deal more about the company than I do, and who indeed maybe have written the authoritative textbooks on the subject. So here goes. Forgive me if I get anything wrong. I'm sure that you'll tell me in the chat if I do. Why is this not working? Oh, just takes a little bit of time. Okay, Perkins Bacon. So Perkins Bacon Co were a firm of Fleet Street printers. You can see a couple of shots of their premises. And they were situated in the Victorian heart, commercial heart of London, and a short walk from up Cannon Street and up Ludgate Hill from the Royal Philatelic Society of London's current premises in Abchurch Lane. And so they remain at the heart, these objects remain very much at the heart of the Royal Philatelic story, both physically and geographically, as it was Perkins Bacon who printed the world's first adhesive stamp, the penny black, in 1840. So originally from the US, Jacob Perkins, a print engraver, emigrated to the UK in 1819 in response to a Bank of England competition. I didn't know this until when I was researching this talk. A Bank of England competition to produce an unforgeable banknote. Now, although he didn't win that competition, the business took root and eventually took off with Perkins Bacon's son-in-law, the incredibly named Joshua Butters Bacon, joining the company in 1829. And they continued to produce stamps and banknotes for both domestic and the international market until 1935, concentrating mainly on Britain's colonial interests, as the next slide shows. So you can see there that they cover everything from Moorgate to Martinique, and everything in between. You know, you've got Brisbane, Antigua, Preston, whoa. They don't often come in the same sentence, do they? Brisbane, Antigua and Preston, but they do here. So what's all this got to do with conservation? So I had my first introduction to the remarkable archive holdings of the Royal Philatelic Society of London late in 2017, way back in 2017. And I was extremely fortunate to be chosen as the Association of Independent Museums, or AIM, assessor for the grant-funded project to assess the condition of the Perkins Bacon and Grover collections, as well as the members' lists and the early minutes of the society. In advance of the move, the really serious and all-consuming move from Regent's Park to the magnificent premises in Abchurch Lane. And I think that that move is very much the archives returning to their geographical roots. So in the assessment, the focus was very much on the Perkins Bacon collections, which form a major part of the overall, door's gonna slam, sorry folks, the overall RPSL collection and a prime resource material for visitors all over the world. At the time, the then curator of the collection was saying that the vast majority of enquiries for information came through about the Perkins Bacon collection. So the assessment itself took place in January 2018, an assessment visit over 2 days, very comprehensive assessment of the housing and the current condition of these objects, as well as the environment in which they were being stored, because it was all going to form a basis for making decisions about the new accommodation. And it was really for the aim, no pun intended, was to make recommendations for their ongoing conservation and preservation, but also to advise on their packing and how they were to be transported from the West End to the East End of London, the City of London. So as is often the case with reasonably small archives and library collections, it's always so inspiring and so incredible, the level of dedication and the responsibility of all the archive and the museum staff and the volunteers to the safe transport and the considerations for the future storage of these objects within the story of philately. And it was really wonderful to see that, and to see it being a prime concern, the care of these collections for that major move and their future home. So that was very, very rewarding to see and very encouraging. So it was clear from the findings in the assessment, however, that through various factors, which I'll discuss in detail in a moment, that the condition of parts of the collection was poor, and that further intervention would definitely be necessary if the collection was to be used for digitisation, which I know is a consideration, to allow the records to be shared across the globe, without any limits, but also for in-person research and display. This latter consideration was a significant ambition of the then curator, Juliet Turk, to enable wider access to the collection and greater interpretation of the Society's aims for members and the wider public alike. And the new exhibition space in Abchurch Lane was a core consideration in the conservation of these objects. So the focus was very much on 11 volumes in the delivery book collection, a very small proportion of the overall Perkins Bacon material, but of really key interest to the story of the firm and the environment in which it was operating in at the time. So originally the delivery books would have consisted of a pair of books, one to record the parcels and orders that were sent out, as you saw from the Antigua and Preston example before, and one which was taken out with the deliveries and written up the following day. So incredibly bureaucratic and incredibly thorough. You know, they embrace this approach most definitely. And the 11 delivery books that were chosen for conservation in this project are the only surviving pairs from the period 1840 to 1901, and the only ones in their original bindings, their original covers, and within their binding context. The majority of the collection had been rebound in the 1990s, and none of the original covers and spines were preserved. So these were a valiant survivors. And to quote Alan Druce, who is a fellow of the Society, I don't know whether he's with us today, who produced a publication on Perkins Bacon called Perkins Bacon, Great Britain Line Engraved Postage Stamp Printing 1840 to 1846. So I think Alan sums it up really very well in that book when he says, whilst the records vary in detail between draft letter books, delivery books, each particular record connects to another. Historically, not only are the archival records unique, both to the philatelist and historians, the records provided a day-to-day insight into the machinations of a Victorian business from which, for example, its security arrangements, working hours, night shift patterns and pay structure can be extrapolated. So that's a huge social history. And clearly there's a need for conserving these records, not only from a philatelic or historical standpoint, but for the need to make these documents available for public viewing. So that kind of sums up almost entirely what conservation of these objects is about. Alan should maybe reconsider his career choice and look into conservation perhaps. He's obviously a natural. So the need to conserve these records was clearly acknowledged, and the institutional will was definitely there. It was extremely encouraging. The staff, the volunteers and the members were all behind this, which is a great bonus for me as the person actually doing the work. But one issue stood in the way, and I think you probably know what I'm going to say. The level of damage to the collection meant that external funding had to be sought, and a successful application was made to two of the key funding sources for manuscript and written heritage conservation, the National Manuscripts Conservation Trust, NMCT, and the Pilgrims Trust, two huge benefactors of written heritage, and without which, you know, significant projects would not take place. And this was necessary, that sort of level of funding was necessary to return these objects to usability for research and display. So in spring 2019, it seems like another lifetime away after what we've been through in the last sort of few weeks. So in spring 2019, the conservation project began, initially with a collection of 3 priority volumes, and then the remainder came along a month later. And the first stage of the project, the initial 3, were very much with the focus of taking these on their first exposure to their adoring public, by taking them to the Stockholmia exhibition, which was a sort of celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Royal Philatelic Society of London, and that was in June 2019. And there they are. That is one of the books that is being very carefully and very respectfully looked at by two interested parties at that exhibition. And it was a great way to sort of celebrate the first stage of the conservation of that project. It was a nice full stop to that. So this provided an unexpected opportunity, in a sense, as it was possible to show the visitors to the exhibition the condition before conservation, because one of the books that was taken three books were taken. One was partway through, one was complete, and one was still in its damaged and prior to conservation condition. So the people visiting that exhibition could see the stabilisation measures that I was taking to ensure that these objects could be reused. And it was interesting for them to see, you know, the various sort of processes that the books would go through, which I'm going to extrapolate out on during this talk now. So our sort of projected timescale was really to continue working on the other volumes in the collection, as well as the two that were either partially or yet to be conserved that went to Stockholmia. And we were hoping for a return date sometime in spring, first sort of quarter of 2020. Or so we thought, and then best laid plans, along comes COVID. But the work has continued in lockdown. I'm quite fortunate in as much that lockdown for me just means less social isolation as my family returned to the fold full time, which in itself has its challenges. And so I was able to continue working on the books throughout this time. So let's have a little look at what I've tried to do with this, because there's so many of these objects, I took aspects of the conservation of several of them and sort of made them into a timeline for one. So you'll see that the finished product isn't necessarily what we've seen further back. So I've tried to sort of make one super book from lots of processes that they've all gone through, just to show you the full range of processes they've gone through. But let's have a little look at the two cornerstones of conservation, which are materiality and condition. So here we go. Look, you can see a tantalizing these lovely labels are really sort of markers of history and geography for these objects. So I'm a huge advocate of the physical object telling more than the story of the information it contains. It's more than the written heritage. And the Perkins Bacon Delivery Books were a classic and very special demonstration of just this, as well as fascinating content, which provides a story of a firm whose ambitions stretched far beyond the confines of the City of London. The clues on purpose and use as key working documents over the 150 years or so of Perkins Bacon history were writ large in their material construction and their pre-conservation condition. So all of the bindings were classic stationary bindings of the early to mid 19th century. And they show both the huge conservatism of this format though very innovative in many ways in terms of making constructional solutions for some of the problems that the stationary binding trade wanted to solve in terms of use and heavy use. You know, they were very much the workhorses. The stationary binder's motto most definitely was if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And there's a huge conservatism throughout the period of stationary binding. And these, you know, this sturdy construction, it's not elegant, it's not fine, it's very sturdy and businesslike, was to effectively shrug off the heavy and, I'm sure, extremely careless use of these objects as the spreadsheets of their day. We've seen that these were taken out and about with people in probably in their coat pocket. not large items, they're sort of about the height of a large size paperback book. And you know, they would have been fairly casually treated compared to how we now treat them in a very, very different way. So again, locality was a key factor in the choice of these books by Perkins Bacon. Let's just go back to the previous slide. Some of them were clearly made by the firm itself in their bindery in what I presume was Whitefriars Street, as it says on the label there. But also by, again, Fleet Street and Chancery Lane. They all seem to sort of move around in this area very much, in this geographical area of London. But by Dunn and Duncan, most of them are constructed by this stationery binders, and in Fleet Street and indeed Chancery Lane. So clearly a legal, mainly for the legal clientele. So, so let's go through this full conservation process, as I say, amalgamating the treatment of several books into one super project. So bear in mind that not all of the books required every single one of these processes, but it's just to give you an overview. So as you can see here, we have a very attractive and reasonably high-end stationery binding. So they've got a parchment cover and a very heavy sort of foredge clasp, some of which were broken, very easily caught on things, and they get torn off, taking a chunk of the cover with it usually. So they're, you know, the covers themselves are extremely robust and are designed to be durable and to shrug off a lot of handling. But I think the condition of these, of this particular one, shows that their construction wasn't strong enough to be able to withstand the handling that they've had. The actual format of the binding is what's called a springback. Now this was this is where the innovation of stationery binders come in. It was an invention in 1799, quite early on, to allow the book to lie extremely flat on the table, so you can write either across the spine fold or very much into the margin, making the best use of your page. And a springback has a very thick and heavy tube on the back, which is very, when they work properly, they sort of almost snap open. They've got a very nice snap action, but they are, the spring is usually stronger than their covering material, so the joints go, as you can see in this, can you see in this one here, these joints, the spine and the joints are broken. So that's a very classic feature, and then a really quite showy label on the front, Perkins Bacon Co. I think it's 59 Fleet Street. So you know, when they were new, they would have been extremely attractive. So you can see here that they're sewn on parchment supports. You can just see this parchment supports here and here, very sort of dirty with the adhesive and time. And you can just see in the gutter here, and also sort of in this image here, the pink interleaving blotters, which were built into the text block as they were being sewn, and you would blot your page as you went, and you tore it away when that page was finished. But because the blotters packed up the foredge, this is the foredge here, when they've torn out, you get this extremely wedge-shaped book, which is very, it just doesn't support the book very well, having it in that sort of wedge shape. It used to be called, I think, when you unintentionally made this shape of the book, it used to be called a hog's back. As you can see, it's sort of got this very severe sort of C shape. So that'll have accelerated its sort of slipping and mobility in in the sewing structure, which in turn sets off a sort of a continuous abrasion and wearing down of that sewing structure, causing it to fail. And you can see here that the sewing, as I say, stationary bindings were all about strength. And you can see here that the sewing here is crossed over. So again, it was sewn on either parchment strips, very strong, or textile webbings. Again, a very strong form of sewing, very robust. And the crossing over of the sewing thread again made it really firm and a very strong construction. But there you can see from this one that it's starting to break down again because of this movement that it's got. Once the spine comes off, it's allowed to move a great deal more, and particularly if it has that wedge shape. And where the sewing has started to break down, you get what's called gapping between the sections, where usually you shouldn't be able to see through the text block to you know, it should be much firmer and together, either with adhesive or with lining. They're just starting to break down, basically. And when the sewing breaks down, not only do you start to get loose sections, you also start to get loose leaves. And once anything starts protruding from the text block, that's when you get edge damage and chipping and loss. So everything's sort of linked back to the sewing. The sewing is your foundation of any binding. So once that starts to go, we're in a bit of bother. So you can see that this one here is in much poorer condition. We've lost our 4-edge clasp. It's taken a chunk of the parchment with it, and the parchment started to peel back. The text block of this one was in several sections. There was a few like this. I think 2 were in pieces, and many were sort of having loose sections, as I was saying before. But this is one of the 2, I think, that were actually in bits. And the ink is interesting. If we're talking about the materiality, the ink is interesting in as much that it will definitely be iron gall ink. Iron gall ink was the primary writing ink from very early on, sort of the 1200s, 1100s even maybe. And there was iron containing inks were known in Roman times, but it was certainly the main ink that was used throughout history until the introduction of synthetic inks in the later 1800s. And certainly iron gall ink makes things a little bit tricky, most definitely. It's extremely susceptible to moisture. So it effectively causes rusting of for want of a better word, of the page. You can see here, I think this is one of the copybooks from the Perkins Bacon collection, very thin, sort of onion skin like paper, and you can see, and this was created with a wet transfer process, so it's corroded the paper very, very much, and sort of bled out from the line of the ink. And that can happen in any sort of moisture within, obviously physical moisture if it's in a flood, but atmospheric moisture as well. So it's extremely susceptible to chemical degradation, iron gall ink. And parchment too. Parchment is extremely hygroscopic, so it will attract water from the atmosphere, and if it is exposed to humidity, atmospheric humidity, without being controlled in, say, a box, or I mean, this one probably is been allowed, it's maybe got a 4-edge clasp and it's been allowed to sort of make a banana shape like that because the clasp is holding it in one point, but it's allowed to dish like that. And so the parchment is extremely reactive, and needs to be sort of controlled and constricted to prevent this sort of thing from happening. But moreover, care has to be taken when you're conserving these materials, that you're not introducing moisture that will cause the problems we've just been talking about. So we have to build that into any adhesives that I'm using or any cleaning processes that I'm using. So let's have a little look at the conservation of our superbook. So cleaning, first of all conservation starts with cleaning. It's almost impossible to conceive of a project that doesn't have some element of cleaning in it. Now, bound objects are both easy and tricky to clean. If it's stained, you can't wash it because it's bound. You can't use an aqueous treatment on a bound object. It just wouldn't work. So you are relying very much on surface dirt cleaning. You can see that in the top there, we've got a flyleaf of an end paper where I've cleaned this corner off here. And that's the dirt on my latex sponge, which is a way of gripping. It's not sticky, it's not wet, the sponge isn't wet or sticky, it's sort of grippy, and it picks up the dirt and keeps it in the sponge, and then you cut away the dirty bit. And it's very effective in removing that loose surface dirt. Likewise, you can see on the edge of the book here, this beautiful marbled edge. You can see the lower half of the text block has been cleaned, and it's much brighter, and it's come up really very nicely and restored to its, or conserved to its, I should say, its former glory. So not only does dirt reduce the aesthetics of an object, but it's not nice to handle. You can cross-contaminate, say you're looking at a whole lot of these books and you're transferring dirt on your hands from one book to another, or your gloves. We'll come to gloves. Somebody's going to ask me about gloves, so we'll come to gloves in a minute. So you can transfer the dirt from one object to another, but also dirt is in itself hygroscopic. It'll attract moisture from the air, causing degradation of the paper and anything it's sitting on. And in high humidity, it can become very sticky and sort of almost cemented onto the edges of the books. But also, dirty materials are what pests like to eat. They are attracted to dirty and neglected objects. And likewise, mold. Mold will preferentially grow on dirty objects. So that's why we need to get rid of the dirt. So the second thing is repair. Now, again, I cannot think of a project where you're not doing some sort of paper repair on a written heritage object. So I use almost exclusively long fibered Japanese paper made from 100% kozo, which is a mulberry bark. And this is adhered with wheat starch paste where there is no text. Now, like I was saying, when you have iron gall ink, you have a substance that's extremely susceptible to degradation through moisture. So by putting an aqueous adhesive like wheat starch paste, which is made from water and wheat starch powder, onto the ink, you could accelerate its degradation and start the process where it drills through the paper. But I just want to show you this because this is a really, I'm hoping this has worked. The next one's a video. So let's just see if this works, because the making of Japanese paper is one of the most lovely substances to use in conservation. And it also has the most incredible heritage and the skill level to produce this incredibly thin, incredibly strong and very pure paper is really rather remarkable. So I've just got a really quick little video to show you here. So we'll just watch a little bit of this remarkable craftsman making his paper. So I think I can set it going. Oh, there we go. So you. So you can see how thin that sheet is. I mean, it's just incredible. And the level of muscle memory and skill that's involved in creating that sheet really is a remarkable thing. Some of the paper is extremely fine, you know, well under 5 grams per square meter, and it's a remarkable craft, and I have huge respect for the Japanese paper makers. So let's have a look. So when dealing with, how do I continue on here? Let's have a look. Why is it not letting me? I go to the end. Oh dear, this is turning into a disaster.
Just click on your next slide.
I think it's, it won't let me. Oh, it's going to start again. Heavens.
So use the advanced slide. You know that that right arrow that we spoke about earlier?
Yeah, look, it's taking it through the do you see it's sort of going on five seconds at a time. Sorry, folks, talk amongst yourselves. Ah.
That's it. Well done.
Sorry. So we were talking before about so the next type of repair is very much over text or over inked areas, and we as conservators use use the same Kozo paper, the same Japanese paper, but use it in a different adhesive method, and this has got the rather clunky name of remoistenable tissue, where you're reinvigorating an adhesive that's been dried onto the paper, the repair paper, the Japanese paper support, to enable it to be adhered onto the iron gall ink. It's a very low aqueous, very low moisture level method of ensuring that you can repair something without affecting the ink. And you can see me in that top photo there, just blotting the small piece of and you can see how thin that Japanese paper is up at the top there. So you can see me, I've cut a little shape out to cover this cracked blot. Somebody's blotted that area of paper, and the blot is cracking and it'll fall out if I don't support it. So unusually I'm repairing it from the verso, sorry, from the recto. Usually repair on the verso, but the other side is even darker ink, and really you're wanting to avoid contact with anything that's too heavily inked. So cut a shape from the Japanese paper, which has got gelatin on the back, a very thin layer of 3% gelatin on the back. Blot it onto the small blotting paper pad, which is moist with a controlled level of moisture, and then pop it down onto the damaged area. So that's how I repair over text areas. So there wasn't a massive amount of iron gall ink repair required in these, because the paper that Perkins Bacon chose for these books was quite thick. So, but even so, there were certain areas that needed to be done. And then resewing, which was required for anything that had, certainly for the ones that were in pieces, but certainly as well for localized resewing for the ones where there was loose sections and loose areas of loose leaves coming out. And I use 100% linen thread, and again over the parchment tapes. And you can see the sewing structure in that one there. Has been completely replaced. You can see as well in this image the amount of spine fold repair that was required. I don't know whether you can see in between the sort of darker areas of original paper, you've got sort of whiter Japanese paper. It it is incredibly time consuming, I have to say. It really is. It's to repair all those spine folds is incredibly time consuming. And that is why we're so grateful to the external funders for allowing this to happen, because it's a major undertaking to work on these books. All of these materials, the linen thread, the Kozo paper, the wheat starch paste, are all chosen because they have known provenance. They're all very, they're known to be stable, they're known to be extremely pure, they're not going to have a deleterious effect on the object itself. They also, I don't really like this term, but they're also technically reversible. And nothing is truly reversible, because whatever you do, you're making a change to that object. But for example, those repairs could all be taken off relatively easily and with little impact on the object. So it has a high level of reversibility, is probably a safer thing to say. So that was the after sewing, and you can see the parchment tapes there, and then lining to provide a little bit of firmness and support back for those for the text block and the backs of the sections. You can see in the lower photo there of the one with the book spine in the wooden press, where I've done some localized resewing. You can just see the threads, the line of threads, as I've caught up the sewing of any loose sections there. And then we come on to the sort of exciting bit, which is recovering, using the some parchment that came from the only parchment manufacturer left in England, Cowley's, in Newport Pagnell. I went on a great visit to their rather Dickensian workshop at the beginning of the project to select some skins. And just a little bit about skins. Most of the parchment that they work with is either cow parchment or calf parchment or goat parchment. And parchment, vellum, you know, they're interchangeable. I always use the term parchment, but neither's wrong. It doesn't really indicate the animal that it came from. And the tradition of using either usually goat or sometimes sheep parchment, the originals would have probably been sheep parchment, is that the parchment that people use in their bindings tends to be the food that they eat. So for example, and it's the same with leather, so in Britain we tend to eat a lot of cows and sheep, so we get a lot of sheep leather and parchment and an awful lot of calf leather and parchment. But in Germany there's a greater tradition of eating pigs, so you know, you get a lot of pig alum tord skins and things like that, and the further you go south you get more goat skins and sheep skins, so it's very much what we eat is what we bind our books in. So you can see there that that's the toned parchment corresponds very nicely to the original colour of the object, and it isn't jarring. When the parchment when I bought the parchment, it was extremely white and rather beautiful, but it needed to be made old and yellow, which was quite fun to do. And that this is a little video of me. The parchment's very thin, but I still need to take just a little bit off those edges, just so it doesn't make a line when I put it underneath the original original boards, under the original cover. So if I can get this to work, we can have a little look at me. It's a bit of a tentative start here. I'm obviously a little bit nervous because I'm being filmed, so forgive the tentative start, but once it gets going, I think it's pretty good. So where's my cursor gone? There it is. Here we go. Look at those gnarled stumps of workers' hands. So just taking off the edge, it makes a beautiful curly, long piece of parchment, just to feather that edge and take it down so it isn't such a There we go. I'm going to get you to try that in a minute. I'm going to set you a task and you've all got to do that. So, return to life. You can see two examples here. I'm sorry, I didn't have a picture of this one finished. You can see that the corners still need to be done when I took this image. But I wanted to show you the various colours of parchment that I've had to tone. I think I've got the two extremes here. So you have our friend here from 1852, which needed a much, much darker toning with the alcohol-based dye, actually, so it doesn't rub off. And you can see here that this one here is really rather is significantly paler, and I've had to make a correspondingly paler toning, watered down with alcohol, my dye there to make it paler. Parchment as well can be quite transparent, so I've had to reline over anywhere where the parchment's going to go, so reline in that channel at the bottom there, this joint here, with some reasonably sort of robust paper to stop the colour of the linings, the original lining showing through. But this one had its springback hollow still on, so that was quite good. But this is the one that the ladies were looking at over in Stockholm, and you can see a little bit of the blotter there is still clinging on, and it's still extant. And it opens beautifully. They're very flexible now. They're in a much more usable and extremely tactile objects now. You know, you want to hold them, you want to get hold of them and use them. So what a transformation from the pictures that we saw at the beginning in their pre-conservation condition. So I think that's pretty much me done. I don't know what the time is, but I think we're about perfect. So it's been truly the most wonderful project to be involved in. The society has been unbelievably supportive and very patient, given the delays and for one reason or another that's happened. And I'm extremely grateful to both Juliet and to Nicola for being such great colleagues and really working with me on this. And it'll be wonderful to allow you all to see these objects and display them, and definitely it would be great to interpret what I've done when the things are back at Abchurch Lane, and people can come and see them and enjoy them as objects, you know, firsthand. That'll be wonderful. So thank you ever so much. Please do feel free to ask questions. I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have. And if you need to rush off, my details are there. You're welcome to get in touch with me at any stage. So I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. I think Chris is going to take some questions now. And sorry.
Yes, certainly. But just to say before that this presentation will be available for viewing on our website in due course, in a fairly short time. So if you have to leave, it will be available to you in future. Some questions then, and they're coming in suddenly. So first of all, can you describe your toning process and what you use to achieve the different shades?
Yeah, toning parchment is not something that I relish. I have to say, I suspect this is from a conservator. The trouble with parchment is that it's getting the sort of dye through the depth of the parchment rather than just sitting on the surface where it'll rub off. I tried both, and also you've got that problem of the reactivity with a water-based dye, which is what you would probably normally use for leather. So you've got the sort of two problems of penetrability and this hugely reactive substance to water. So I tried three methods. I tried on test sample, obviously. I tried a water-based dye. The dye I use is Celicet. It's got a new name now, and I can't remember what it's called. Rhoda dyes. And I use those in water and alcohol, and pure alcohol. And the one that I found to be both very good at going through the depth of the parchment, through the whole of the parchment skin depth, but also didn't rub off, was the pure alcohol. It also controlled, even though alcohol does have, ethanol has a small amount of water in it, it did control that excessive immediate reaction to water. And then I put it between blotters and dried it under a little bit of pressure, just so it was restricted in its movement. And it worked really well, yeah.
Thank you. So it wasn't just cold coffee then?
No, alas not. I am drinking cold coffee now.
I've got another question for you, which is, can you share more about cleaning the dirt off? It looked like some sort of old-fashioned blackboard duster that you were using. What was it? Where do I get one? And can a non-expert use one? Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, no, you've got to train for years to use one. No. They are called latex sponges or smoke sponges, and they're basically, as you might imagine. So imagine a sort of a very dense but soft. It's not like a bath sponge. It's got a slight sort of, as I say, grippiness to it. You have to be. You do have, I mean, I'm joking about being trained for years, obviously, but you do have to be slightly careful using them, because not only can you rip, they're quite grippy. So if the paper in particular is damaged or torn in any way, they can tear the paper more because they're grippy. And also they are quite abrasive. So say you had, they should never ever be used on things like photographs or anything that is quite smooth surfaced, because they are quite abrasive. They also can on parchment lift text, so which is kind of extreme cleaning. Right. And not really what you want. So, but with that proviso, and I accept no responsibility in saying this, because for your missing text and ripped documents, but I think they can be bought. I think they used to be used for smoke removal on walls and things, after, for shop damage, smoke and dirt, that sort of thing. So I think they are called smoke sponges. I mean, you can get them from the various conservation suppliers, but I think you'll probably be able to get one on Amazon.
Thank you.
But don't quote me on
how to achieve it. Is it called a palimpsest?
Yes, you can certainly prepare your palimpsest with one of those.
Right. So here's another one. How did you compensate for the wedge shape caused by the blotter remnants?
Yeah,
did you remove the blotter when resewing?
Did I remove the blotter when resewing? Was that?
Yes.
The blotter had gone. I mean, that one that I showed you there with the very pronounced wedge shape, the blotter had gone, and I had to work with what I had. It will always be wedge shaped. The box that it goes into may have probably. I haven't fitted them to the boxes yet, but it'll probably have to have a wedge in it to allow a little bit of pressure from the box. But otherwise, there's not a great deal I can do about it. I don't like interleaving. It just is messy. People don't put it back in the right place. How could you possibly expect researchers and people using the books to do that? So it has to remain very wedge shaped. But when I was working on the books to get, say, the new parchment on, or to reline it, I packed it out with thin blotter just to give that shape. So it was going back into a sort of its correct shape, a sort of a tight, correct shape. so I could actually reline it more satisfactorily. But then that had to come out. So it is still, I'm afraid, extremely hogs-backed.
Right. Okay. So how long does it take? From Charles Oppenheim, how long does it take to conserve a single book?
Well, you need to be patient, I think, is probably the safest thing to say. But I mean, it varies. The ones for the sewing are probably, I work on about 3 days for one that needs sewing. So, and that's with all the paper repair on the backs of the sections, like you saw, and if it needed any textbook repair. And a lot of the parchment covers were, actually one of them, I meant to take a photo of it this morning. I was just looking at it. The cover has clearly been nibbled away by mice at some stage. And it's probably when it was still with Perkins Bacon. I'm not at all imputing that the Royal Philatelic Society would ever have mice in its storage areas. You know, that filling in that sort of detail, because remember, these are for display. They have to have an aesthetic, there has to be some aesthetic sensibilities as well as the structural sensibilities for repair. So, you know, filling in those took a little bit longer, but about 3 days, I would say, is probably on average for something that's fairly badly damaged that needs to be returned to use.
Super. Is there any alternative? Is there any European alternative to that Japanese paper? Says Jerome Blaines.
No, I mean, obviously, European paper is a thing of glory too. I mean, you know, beautiful European papers, there's nothing like them, but they have a different function. So, for example, if I was needing to, it's horses for courses. So if I was wanting to recover something, say in a cover paper, then European paper, thick, almost cartonnage type European cover paper is second to none. I mean, the craftsmanship that European paper makers have for you know, that type of paper is really remarkable. But in terms of the repair papers, that long fibered Japanese kozo, you know, obviously the mulberry grows in Japan. You know, the climate lends itself to this paper production. It's quite a cold process. You know, I think that there's nothing like it, and the level of sort of craftsmanship and skill that goes into the production of Japanese paper is superb. You know, these are families of people who have worked in this tradition for you know, generations, and they have a national treasure status, a lot of them. So they're definitely to be respected and supported. You do get paper making throughout East Asia, and you get paper making in Thailand and also in Korea, and there's some very good papers produced in those countries, but they also very frequently have the lower grade papers in both Japan and Korea and Thailand have a lot of wood pulp or mixed fibers, and I don't want that. I want purity's a very key part of what I need to have in my repairs. So,
okay. Somebody, Francis Podger says, where do you do the work? Where do you do this conservation work?
I have a studio, a small studio, which is affectionately known as the Pod, which I built in my garden. So I'm very fortunate to have a nice big garden. And so my commute to work is 10 seconds, which is probably why, since becoming self-employed, I've gone up 2 dress sizes.
Right. Now, we're coming up to the hour. I'm going to answer one question which I can answer, and then I'm going to say some thank yous, and then we're going to carry on. So if you wait for the thank yous and then you really must leave because you've got other things to do, please do. But we will carry on with the 15 new questions which have arisen in the last 10 minutes. So Lucy Charles asks, where will they be housed now they've been conserved? And I can answer that question. one of the reasons the Royal Philatelic Society moved to a new home in Abchurch Lane in the City of London was because storage was not exactly first rate. And yes, Victoria, there were mice known to have been there. So now we have a purpose-built, climate-controlled vault at second basement level. And really, if you ever came to Abchurch Lane and wonder where all the money went, the money really has gone into the second basement. And we have 3 climate-controlled vaults there and a prepared workroom. So these will live in our large vault in a special, well, in a space reserved for rare books and other rare material. So they will live probably for the first time since they were made in what we hope will be ideal conditions. So first of all, can I thank you enormously, Victoria, for this fascinating exposition, and we now have 16 questions. It's really been very interesting, and I think the level of interest, we had 68 people at the start of the event, and we've still got 60 odd. So thank you very much. Thank you also to our guests, that is those who are not members of the Royal Philatelic Society London. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. And as I said before, this will be available on our website, probably in the course of the next 3 or 4 days at the longest, depending on how long Mike takes to put it together. So thank you for our guests from the conservation world and from the Mulberry Group. It was super to have you here. And thank you also to our members for attending. And many of you have attended the whole series of 6, with the 7th in 2 weeks' time, presentations that we've had. It's been a great success, and we have requests for continuing this in due course. So now 17 questions. So we're going to say, if you're going to leave us, please leave. If you want to stay, please stay. We will endeavour to answer all of the questions. So thank you very much. There we go, suddenly 54.
Yeah.
So
about these questions.
These questions now.
I just want to say, actually, Peter I. Mack, I'm not sure what Peter's name is anyway, Peter, has made a really good point that Gangolf Ulbricht in Berlin makes a Japanese style paper, which is an incredibly lovely paper, Berlin tissue, with an incredibly high price, but it is a really superb paper. So there is some Japanese style papers outside of Japan, but I'm very fond of, or very keen on supporting Japanese paper production, because it must be a tough life to make your money that way, and it's hard work.
Okay, so thank you for that. Anne Hillam asks, did you line the parchment? She may have missed this, but did you line the parchment before rebacking?
Yes, I did. Well, I did and I didn't, because I was slightly worried. I was slightly worried about getting, it's extremely thin, and I was slightly worried about getting distortions. So what I did was line the book and then pop the parchment on. So effectively it is lined. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. If it doesn't make sense, I'm sure our questioner will come back with a supplementary.
Absolutely.
Peter Coburn's asking, where do we get the cleaning sponge? And I think you answered that by saying...
I dread mentioning these wretched cleaning sponges, because I sort of wake up sweating and screaming in the night at the thought of all these people setting off and hammering away on their books.
Well, the question is, can it be used on a dirty philatelic cover?
I wouldn't be able to say without seeing the dirty philatelic cover.
Very, very judicious answer. Francis Podger asks, are we able to give some background on the funders, the Pilgrims Trust? I don't know whether Nicola can answer that question. I can't answer it very well.
Not really, not without going to look it up. I don't know if Victoria can maybe answer better than me, because it's Pilgrims Trust and the National Manuscripts Conservation Trust.
They're both, yeah, I mean, they're both incredibly generous, as I said, generous benefactors of written heritage. Both, you know, sort of private trusts based on a charitable foundation. I mean, the Pilgrim Trust are bigger in terms of their scope than National Manuscript Conservation Trust, but both are huge supporters of this type of work. NMCT, National Manuscript Conservation Trust, is purely, you know, on this type of material, and you know, an incredible resource for conservation. I mean, really very impressive. And you know, both funders are hugely supportive of the sector. I mean, amazingly so, really.
Well, we have an enormous, we have a great deal more to conserve, and I think this will be the subject of further applications in due course. I mean, it's an important archive, and I was very pleased that Victoria talked about the context of the archive, both philately and historically, and in fact commercially. So we have a long way yet to go, and I think these books will be of interest to, in fact, the whole archive is of interest to researchers in many fields. I think
that's it. It's seeing your archive as an asset, not as a liability. And you know, conservation is all about assetizing, if that's even such a word, your archive.
Assetizing, it sounds like something that the American military might say.
Sounds like a Bushism.
So, 2 questions from Frank Walton. Have these been digitized, and can researchers handle the books now to make their notes?
That's probably a Nicola question.
No, not all the Perkins Bacon's been digitised. Some of it did need to be stabilised first, and still does. But Victoria's work will make these that you can handle them to do the research and make notes with a soft pencil nearby.
Mm-hmm. The key thing when you're using these objects, and any historical bound archival objects, is to support them on your, like the ladies in the Stockholmia exhibition, support it so that your angle of opening is roughly 90 degrees. So that would be the best thing that anybody can do. Nice. Let's deal with the gloves now. Nice clean hands. We don't need gloves unless we're handling metals. So if you're handling the if you're handling the metals, yes, on with your gloves. And I would always favour nitrile gloves over cotton gloves. But otherwise, you're wanting spanking clean hands. No just going and eating a massive donut and then wandering into the search room. Nice clean hands, you know, like we've all have now, of course, because of COVID. And keep your hands clean. Make sure that you know, keep checking them. Everybody gets dirty hands when you're working with this sort of material, but keep them nice and clean. Support the book. Be really careful. Do a little risk assessment of the object. If it's damaged, you know that you've got to be careful. So it's just simple stuff like that. Just be mindful of what the object is, and spatially make sure it's not going to have anything falling on it, or you're not balancing it on something. So simple things like that would help. Yeah.
And I think the other thing that Chris didn't mention about our new premises is that now there is a purpose built research room for looking at this material, which does have all the book cushions and supports, yes, and snakes and everything, and cameras, and it is supervised, and it's where the book eye scanner is, so any scans of fragile material take place there. So there's no balancing it with a cup of coffee and a biscuit anymore.
No.
Okay. Thank you. That's a very good advertisement for behaving yourself in the library. Somebody, Aditya Sony asks, what was the GSM of the Japanese paper used? And I thought it was 5 grams per square meter.
The one that was on the remoistenable tissue, that was a very light paper. I think that was that was RKO. So I don't know what that is. Very, very thin, an incredibly thin paper, under 5 GSM, I'm sure. But it varies. I use papers up to sort of 30 odd GSM for infills, for example. So you match your paper to what you're working on, basically. If I've just done a massive collection of very mold damaged objects, and of course they need an incredibly light paper, because if it was a heavier paper, it would form a line that would break, basically. So, you need to alter your paper accordingly. But certainly for the remoistenable tissue, I use a very light paper. That's Berlin tissue is what a lot of people use for remoistenable tissue repairs.
Thank you. Josh, do you have any, Hugh Shapter asks, do you have any longevity concerns whatsoever over any of the materials or substances or dyes that you have used, with longevity being described as 100, 200 and so on years? UV damage, for example. Well, I can tell you they're in the dark at the moment, and it is dark down there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, light is the greatest threat to all of these, really. Once you get handling out of the way, handling is absolutely crucial. But certainly, in terms of the material stability, the big question mark is indeed the dyes used for the either the toning of the paper or the toning of the parchment. But the dyes I use, again, are really tested for this type of work. They have an incredible, certainly incredible water fastness, which is important given that archives seem to attract flooding incidents, and also that their light fastness is, again, sort of heightened, but that any light is going to be damaging. I mean, we have to, as conservators, I think one of the things that we don't necessarily deal very well with is when we're talking about how long do we expect something to last. And it's very rare that anybody will commit to saying, okay, 500 years, this is what we're hoping for this object. But these are the sort of conversations we need to have. We can't keep on ignoring that question, and we have to be realistic in what we're wanting to achieve. So my job at the moment is to build in as long extended lifespan as I can possibly manage, but then the responsibility comes with how the object is handled and how it's displayed. I think I was certainly talking with you, Nicola, I'm sure, or during the process of applying, about light loggers. If there's one phrase I use more than anything else is this area could really do with a light logger, because it's really important to manage your light exposure, particularly if things are on display. It's the only way that you know how it's going to react and how it's going to last.
I think at the Royal we are much more acutely aware of these issues than we were, say, 10 years ago.
That's great. If I've been a small part of that, that's my job done. I can die happy.
Well, that's fine. Thank you. I think there's a lot more of this job to be done here. But Peter Coburn says, if you Google for smoke sponge, you'll find lots of availability. Charles Oppenheim says, thank you very much. Peter Imack says, hi, Victoria.
Hi.
And Frank Walton says, is there a vegetarian alternative to vellum?
Oh, I wish there were. Not being particularly keen on eating the animals, I just put them on books. No, there isn't really. I mean, I say that, you can, a great colleague of mine, she has produced Anne-Marie Miller has produced a really good way of laminating paper. is it with textile maybe underneath? Anyway, a very good way of reproducing parchment using paper. And you can, with the thicker Japanese papers in particular, you can sandwich them together and then press them with, say, you know, something smooth like Melanex, and it gives a sort of parchment-like feel. But actually sort of having a veggie parchment, I've never seen it.
So, thank you. Jerome Blaine says purity was the magic word. Thanks. Sujit Singh says, thank you so much, Victoria. This is really great.
Good.
Wanda Robin says, thank you so much, Victoria. Really great presentation. Appreciate all the clear explanations of the materials and your ACE conservation.
Goodness, I'm going to get terribly big-headed. I think you should probably stop reading these out.
I'll come up with another question. Peter Imack's back. What are the papers used for the books? And that's when he goes on to talk about the two GSM Berlin tissue.
What are the papers used for the books, was that?
Yes. I don't know what.
So they're used for, tell me if I'm understanding right. So they're used for paper repair on the text blocks. So you support tears with the paper. So it almost bridges damage. Is that what Peter meant, do you think?
I don't know. We'll find out in a minute. Is Peter there?
Okay. If I haven't answered.
If we haven't answered, can we save it up for later? Lindsay says she's just discovered that you can wash smoke sponges.
They tend to go a little bit crumbly though. That's the only thing.
And Maggie says, what is the point of your work being able to be reversed?
Well, we've conservation. We have a how can I phrase this? We don't want to be so arrogant that we think that we're the last people ever to work on this object. And what I do now, maybe somebody in 100 years' time may look at that and go, "What on earth was she doing?"
Yeah.
And so, if there's better methods in the future, then it's good if I have a light touch, if my footprint is very light on this object. That's maybe that's the definition of conservation.
Thank you. Did you need, this is from Anne Hillam, did you need to humidify any of the boards or covers to flatten them?
Well, some of them are pretty tricky to humidify because they're got these wretched clasps and things on, so they're very difficult. They really they don't make it easy for me. I have found that I'm a great fan of weight for any flattening process. I really try to reduce moisture content in everything that I do in terms of treatment. I just think that adding moisture is often a really bad idea. So I have had some of them underweight. Some of them have needed a little bit of moisture on the inside just to get it going, get the process going. But the weight has really worked well. And I think that I don't mind board distortion so very much if it isn't having an impact on the functionality.
Thank you. Just a question from Francesca Wymark. The medium for carrying the dyes used for toning, was the alcohol ethanol or isopropanol?
Ethanol.
Ethanol.
Yeah, IMS.
Fine, thank you. Gosh. I'm just picking out what's the most, okay, this is a general question. You've done a number of projects, many projects. Which was the most challenging?
The last one. No, I suppose that things that are the material. So conservation is all about materiality and construction, basically, sort of sorting out those two problems. Construction, it's kind of like car maintenance. So construction, you can always deal with if you have good materials. But if you don't have good materials, then the construction becomes infinitely more problematic. So one of the most sort of, that I can think of easily, one of the most challenging conservation projects to allow something to be handled again was for the Leith Hill Musical Festival Committee, who had a really lovely annotated score, Vaughan Williams annotated score, from the really, so the first third, I can't remember the exact date, I think it was 1930-ish maybe. A German score, very, very poor quality paper. Yeah. But Vaughan Williams had interpreted this with sort of strips of paper and lots of very sort of elaborate and scrawly, rather creative looking writing. And he'd annotated this, so, you know, again, a lot of people wanted to see this object, to see Vaughan Williams's interpretation of this score, and also it was a key part of the repertoire for the Leith Hill Musical Festival in Dorking, which was set up by Vaughan Williams. But the paper was appalling. I mean, it was fractured. It was a lot of sort of late 19th century, early 20th century European papers were very short fibered wood containing papers. You looked at it and it fractured. So trying to get this back to being a usable object was an incredible challenge. But we went down the digitization route, so stabilization for digitization, and then the digital copy took the handling.
Yeah, well, we've got a number of philatelic magazines from the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And they are barely, well, they're not really capable to be handled.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it?
It is. Francesca Weimark asks, just makes a note again, alternatives to parchment, cross-grained Japanese and Western paper, and Marie's method.
Yeah.
And she says she's used heavyweight Japanese paper lined with aero cotton.
Absolutely, that's a really good good alternative. The only thing is that sometimes you have to really press the paper and aero cotton, and then you get the grain coming through of the aero cotton. And also Japanese paper, you probably need to sometimes using wheat starch paste with that, it delaminates, so it can be just a torturous thing to cover with, because it's delaminating as you're trying to turn it in. Anyway, that's a little sort of technical point.
Thank you. I've got a question about smell, really.
I saw this one coming up.
Does some of your material have any kind of adverse aroma? That's one half of the question. The other half of the question doesn't say that philatelists used universally to smoke. But they did. And you get albums and books in collections, and you get them home, and they make the place smell like the saloon bar at chucking out time. Can you do anything to reduce the smell of smoke on paper?
Okay, so this is a little bit strange, but I did have some success with this. So there was a flood, of course there was, because all archive stores are constructed under student bathrooms.
No.
I'm glad to hear that the Royal Philatelic Society of London is leading the way in bucking this trend. But so you often get very sort of damp and damp smelling books. And I had one from a college who remain unnamed that was really unpleasant. I mean, I don't know what on earth had been going on there, but it was really grim. So I had this from an object conservator to reduce smells in objects, in museum objects. You put in one of those clippy boxes, plastic sort of really useful boxes, you put a layer of cat litter in, stay with me people, you put a layer of cat litter in the bottom, and then in terms of keeping the two apart, I put like a membrane, something like Gore-Tex, not Gore-Tex, Tyvek, but you wouldn't necessarily need to do that. You could sit your book, say, fanned out on a piece of paper, just so it doesn't come into contact with the cat litter. And then you seal the box in and you leave it for a good bit. And it doesn't get rid of it, but it does reduce it. So I would try that. Top tip, you heard it here.
Top tips, yes. Well, another top tip from Anne Hillam, a laminated hanji, that's a Korean paper with no chain lines, and then tones to match the parchment. It's also very effective if you can't use parchment. Yes,
it's true that the laid lines in paper is the difficulty of using that for large areas. Say you've got the spine missing. The last thing you want is the laid lines, which are the very sort of watermark lines in laid paper going down your spine. That would look absolutely appalling. So a sort of more wove paper, like the hanji paper is.
Got a question from Peter Coburn, which is something which challenges philatelists generally.
Oh.
Can you advise on the removal of foxing on paper?
Okay, so foxing is a really tricky thing. Nobody quite knows what causes it, but I suspect it's metallic contaminants in the paper, combined possibly with microbial activity, so some sort of mold, but certainly it's a moisture accelerated process. And unless anybody on the chat can prove me wrong, or tell me I'm wrong, which I'm quite prepared to accept, I think the only way to remove it or reduce it is bleaching, which is something that we don't do so much in conservation anymore. And I've got a feeling that it can return, even if your beautiful print is bleached, even with light bleaching is what a lot of people use now, very heavy UV, light exposure. And I think it can return because of the fact that it's metallic contaminants actually in the paper, probably from the chopping of in the Hollander beater. So you're onto a sort of atmospheric moisture is the problem. So keep it in a better, drier environment, but it's probably something that's happened ages ago.
Yeah. It's a big issue.
Yes, I'm sure.
Yes, just a comment from Francesca Weimark, which is worth, I think, reading out, that she says, you're right, I did have to use Eve-Con adhesive mixed with wheat starch to laminate the textile, but it was then adhered to the object using wheat starch.
Yeah. That's it. I mean, that's a really good idea. I mean, you can get all sorts of textile conservation adhesives like Lascar, which is heat reactivated. You use it like a film, and then a bit like the remoistenable tissue. But Evacon's good, and if it's not coming into contact with the object, then there's no problem, definitely. But you probably do need a synthetic. Somebody told me once that you could use potato starch for adhering paper and textile, and I've always meant to try that. But anyway, that's a side point.
I think we're coming up to the end of the questions. I have one here about removing stains. And I'm not sure, this is from Mark Andava. He says there's a German stain remover chemical which comes in 2 bottles.
Okay.
Sort of an A bottle and a B bottle, and you apply A, wait 3 minutes, apply B. I don't know what it is, but stain removing on philatelic material is tempting, because of course if it looks more pristine it tends to fetch more money when you resell it.
Oh yes, I can understand that.
Stain removing is what sort of, there's no more information in the question, so that's all I can really ask.
Well, at moments like this, I don't know whether anybody is a fan of Hilaire Belloc. This has a point, but Hilaire Belloc wrote a fantastic poem about somebody becoming doing his own electrical repairs and getting electrocuted. And I kind of, and I think the punchline of the sort of ditty was, don't be tight, employ somebody to do it. And I think in terms of stain removal, that is probably what I'd recommend. And I'm not looking for work, believe me, but at the same time, I think that some of these proprietary chemicals are extremely aggressive and probably contain peroxide, which, as we know from hair colorants of old, shall we say, can be fairly extreme and irreversible.
Okay, there's an enormously simple question with a very straightforward answer, I expect. In philately, we keep our material in what we call plastics, but are not plastic. we use Melanex and all sorts of things to put the material in to keep it safe. What is the best kind of, quotes, plastic to put paper material in to keep it conserved?
Definitely Melanex. Anything that has, like those punched pockets you get from WH Smith, which is floppy, doesn't have that crackle that Melanex has. They'll have plasticizers in them now. It's the plasticizers that are the problem in plastics. So in an enclosure where there's not much air transfer, you'll get those plasticizers degrading and affecting the object in. Melanex is inert. It doesn't, it just is. It doesn't really degrade, and certainly not any, if we're talking about time, not in any rapid way. So because it's a polyester, it's extremely stable. So the only disadvantage of Melanex is that it has a static charge. So if you have anything that's damaged and you try to pull it out, it'll lift the damage off, and that's the only disadvantage. So just be careful with putting things that are damaged into Melanex. Put them into a paper fold first and pop them in your Melanex.
Yes, it'll hang on to the pieces that are left over after the iron galling, because
it definitely will. Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
There's a number of questions talking about bleach and Milton tablets and things in order to remove stains, which I'm going to skip over for the minute.
Hilaire Belloc.
Hilaire Belloc, because I'm aiming at about 3:30.
Sure.
I've got another question from Anne Hillam, which is, did you reconstruct the spring back mechanism when rebacking?
I did reconstruct one of them. However, I was a little bit concerned about the fragility of some of the spine folds. I think that it is quite an aggressive sort of opening mechanism. It's very nice. It's a very nice thing, but I did worry that it would be too much. So, but I did do one, and quite a few of them actually still have their spine, their spring tube. So they could be reconstructed that way. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of a combination of both. It's fun to do though. It's a fun process to do.
Thank you. I think this might actually be the last question.
Okie dokie.
No, there's another one. No, nice talk, that is, from Anne Hillman. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
From Abhishek Buwalka in Mumbai, it's always humid, leading to books and stamps foxing. What's the proper RH that one should be keeping books and philatelic material in?
Okie dokie. So any paper object is pretty much the same. I mean, stamps are an additional problem is that they have adhesive on the back, and any moisture in the air will maybe reactivate that adhesive and stick things together, which is a problem. But the current guidelines for mixed archive collections is a temperature of between 13 and 21 with an average of 18 degrees over a year, and an RH, a relative humidity, of between 35 and 60, with stability being the key. So if you're managing to keep your collections around about the sort of 16 to 18 degrees and between, you know, sort of probably in the middle of that, you know, the old golden number was 55% relative humidity. But in a tropical climate, that is not only extremely difficult, but also incredibly environmentally unsound and is very, very difficult to maintain. And you're relying on air conditioning. So in that situation, I would probably, again, use a much simpler method where you're limiting the amount of air that something gets. So into a really useful box, something like that with a clip lid. And you can use desiccant silica sachets to control or reduce the humidity. Ideally, you would have a data logger in there as well to see what's going on, so you're not making it too dry and making the object brittle. But I would have thought that reducing the amount of air, ambient air, that comes into contact with your object and drying out that environment is probably the easiest way in a tropical climate.
Right. I think Abhishek has come on with a supplementary. but I think you actually answered the supplementary in the original question.
Much, yeah.
And I can tell you that the vaults downstairs are 53% at the moment, Ari.
How wonderful.
So, right, I think that we have come to a natural end of the questions. And I think that, I'm just trying to minimize that, yes. And I just would like to reiterate our thanks. There have been an enormous number of thanks, which I confess I've skipped over in the chat. I think this has been really, really useful. And I think there's a lot for us to learn. And I think conservation might be one of those subjects which the Royal returns to periodically, because there's clearly a very high level of interest in it, both from philatelists, but also from other conservationists.
That's great.
One of our objectives is to bring people who are not philatelists to the Royal to see our other collections, because we have material which is useful and informative to many, many, many walks of life, because the truth is that the Post covered all of human society and most activities one way and the other. So thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you very much to our guests. Thank you for Nicola for organising this
Thank you, Nicola.
Series. And thanks to Mike and Mark for making sure we stay technically on the ball.
Indeed.
And I think that might be thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all listening.
Thank you for presenting. It was a very interesting talk indeed.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I did. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all. I'll now close the meeting and have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Super.
You too.
Take
Bye.
care.